Just the image of a flight is almost perfect. So a plane, or a plane in the airport as a combination. The airport is a place where you go. You have a different lines for which ticket you've booked or which frequent flyer program you've been successful in. You have a fast track through immigration if you've done well, and you have to stand in a line and move slowly if you've done not so well. You have a lounge if you've done well, you don't if you haven't done well. And when you get in the plane, you have more room and a bigger seat and you can sleep, and even more oxygen. There's more oxygen in the front of the plane than there is in the back of the plane. More toilets available per person. This is a metaphor for the politics of mobility, basically.
Hello, everyone. Evan Estrak here.
And I'm Stephanie Tam.
Welcome to Behavioral Scientist Reads,
the podcast that explores what it means to be human through conversations at the intersection of science and culture, and books that illuminate who we are and who we can become. Hey, Evan.
Hey, Stephanie.
So, this season we are reading Polish author Olga Tokarczuk's Flights, which is a strange and wonderful novel that defies categorization.
We sure are. And in our last episode, we introduced the novel and the author herself, Tokarczuk's background in psychology, how she got into writing, her childhood in Poland, and more.
Today, we're going to dive deeper into one of the major themes of the book, movement.
Oh, now we're moving.
Yes, we are. And if you've gotten past the first several sections of Flights, you'll know that movement and mobility actually come up quite a lot. And about 80 pages into my Fitzcarraldo edition, there's this really curious section in which we're presented with a young woman who's giving a lecture in an airport on something called travel psychology. And when I first read that, I was like, what's travel psychology?
Yeah, I had the same reaction. I mean, I studied psychology. I've been working with psychologists for years, but this is the first time I heard the term, and I was really, really intrigued.
Yeah, well, in the book, the young woman describes it to us this way. Ladies and gentlemen, travel psychology studies people in transit, persons in motion, and thus situates itself in opposition to traditional psychology, which has always investigated the human being in a fixed context, in stability and stillness. But then she argues, if we wish to catalog humankind in a convincing way, we can do so only by placing people in some sort of motion, moving from one place towards another. This has meant that for some time in travel psychology, there have been certain prevailing voices claiming that there can be no other psychology besides travel psychology.
I really love those passages on travel psychology, and particularly the challenge that Tokarczuk throws out there through this lecturer, that our starting point for psychology should be that we are people in motion, not people in a place, just a static place.
Yeah, it's clearly meant to be thought-provoking. And anyway, it made me curious about whether there was actually such a thing as travel psychology, or at least if there were scientists who studied people in transit and tried to catalog humanity through the study of movement. And amazingly, I found someone who does just that.
Good sleuthing, Stephanie. So what did you find out?
Well, you'll just have to listen on. Before we dive in, let's just share a bit about where we're going with these expert conversations and how they fit into the book club. So our aim is to draw out a key theme or question from the book and then explore it with experts from across the sciences and humanities. In these conversations, we're not necessarily aiming to discuss specific passages from the book, but to use it as a launching point to dive deeper on a given subject. Then, in our group discussions, we can bring together ideas from the book, these expert conversations, and our own thoughts and reactions to figure out what it means and what we can learn from it. Now, let's begin. Today, we're joined by a guest expert who studies the science of how people move and what mobility reveals about our relationship to each other and the world.
My name is Tim Cresswell. I'm a professor of geography at the University of Edinburgh. I'm also a poet and a writer of narrative nonfiction.
Like the novel's narrator, who describes herself as rootless, Tim actually has a long and personal history of moving around the world.
My dad was in the Air Force when I was born in Norfolk. Soon after that, we posted to Berlin, and early years were spent in Berlin during the Cold War where my brother was born. But later we went to Singapore and came back to Oxfordshire to RAF Prize Norton. So going to Singapore was really important because my parents both left school at 16. Dad joined the Air Force, Mum trained to be a nurse. We would never have had the life we had if it hadn't been in the military, because parents that leave school at 16 generally don't travel in that way. So at the age of 8, I guess, I was on a plane and flying, first flight I remember, flying to Cyprus and then to the Gan, which is in the Maldives, and then to Singapore because planes didn't fly that far back then, and had to be refueled. And then arriving in this tropical environment that the air and the rain and everything feels different. Like, you know how different it is. And pretty soon my parents were quite adventurous in terms of traveling and eating and things like that. They didn't try and maintain a British diet. So quickly found like satay stands and macan stores and all kinds of interesting things to eat. So food became important to me. So I remember that Singapore years as being wild and interesting and exciting. And I remember also coming back from Singapore because I remember it was grey and rainy. And I remember getting some milk to drink. And it was full-fat milk, and I hadn't tasted full-fat milk for ever, really. And suddenly my mouth was coated with fat, and it was a very strange taste. So, but I don't remember the kind of more existential. I must have sort of felt it. I must have felt displaced at some point, but I don't remember it. But what I know has influenced me was always, to this day, being interested in going to other places and what new places bring, and recognizing that the world is full of different histories, if you like, that everywhere you go, you're time traveling as well as space traveling. You're in a different linear and a different development, or whatever the right word is, a different history, that something else in the past is different from where you are. So the present is different and the future will be different. So I think spatial traveling is also time traveling, and I find that interesting.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So how did you get into the field of geography?
So when I was at high school, I wanted to be a writer and I wanted to do a degree in English. And at the time, it was very hard to get into an English degree in Britain. And so I knew I wasn't going to get the A-level results, and geography was supposedly easy. And when I got there at UCL, just at the beginning of my second year, I did a course called Humanistic Geography that was transformative. It taught me that the things I thought were interesting about literature and about writing were also potentially part of geography. And so I changed my mind, basically. I discovered that geography could be about worlds of meaning and writing and being creative within it. And so I stuck with it. After that, I went to London, went to do my postgraduate degrees in America, in Wisconsin, and really haven't stayed anywhere long since then. I think the longest I've ever lived anywhere is 7 years. And the longest job I've had is this one in Edinburgh, which is just past 7 years on July the 1st. So yes, I've led a peripatetic life.
Oh, wow. Yeah, well, it's probably good to actually talk a little about what geography is, because I think to the extent that many people are familiar with it, I think there is a strong association with the study of place. And that is part of it, but there's also clearly more. So I'd love to hear from you. What is missing from this paradigm of geography as simply the study of places?
Well, one thing that's different is to change that description, just take the S off places and say the study of place. So one version of geography is like there's lots of places in the world, let's think about them. And that's an honorable exercise. But to say it's a study of place is to change that focus slightly and think about, well, what is it that they all have in common? Like, what is place? Which is a much more philosophical question, one that wasn't really asked by the discipline until the 1970s. And it was precisely that question that was written about in a book called Space and Place by who became my supervisor, Ifu Tuan, in Wisconsin. And so one thing geography is, to me, it is the study of geographical facts, if you like, geographical parts of life, and how the role that they play in who we are and how we relate to other people, and indeed how we relate to the world beyond people, the physical world too. Second answer to your question is, as well as being the study of place, geography is also the study of moving. And so this is an even more recent development in the discipline in a way, which is that to think of geography as a study of place is to fall into what, in very jargonistic conceptual geography terms, is called sedentarist metaphysics, which means basically that we think of things in fixed ways as fixed in space. And that means that things that aren't fixed become suspect and difficult to deal with. The most obvious example is we think of people as belonging to places. Most often, we think of them as belonging to nation states. So you're British or, whatever country you choose. And once you start thinking in those terms, then anyone who exists outside of that could be a foreign person in another land. So it could be a tourist, a traveler, or an immigrant. It could be someone that travels more or is identified with travel more, such as a gypsy traveler, or a traveling salesman, or a jet setter, or a refugee. All of these people become complicated people. They become people that don't fit into the idea that people belong in place. And so therefore out of place. And how do you deal with that?
Yes. Yeah, that makes sense. That kind of leads on to, I was also going to ask, what is mobility studies?
Sure. So around about 2000, people in different disciplines, but I would say the first primary people were in sociology, John Urry in particular, Mimi Scheller, developed the idea of what they called a new mobilities paradigm, which is also called the mobilities turn and has become mobility studies as it's become more entrenched. And the idea for this was precisely what I was just saying, which is that disciplines think of things in fixed terms. So John Urry talked about sociology as traditionally the study of societies, and a society was a fixed and bounded thing, this society and that society. And what he argued was that what this ignored was both the incredibly modern prevalence of movement in a, postmodern or post-postmodern hypermobile world that's globalized, and it effectively black boxed or put into a kind of, we're not going to ask any questions about this kind of mode, anything that didn't fit into that. Similar things were happening in anthropology. James Clifford wrote a book, Roots, which is kind of opposed to roots, roots with a U as opposed to roots with two O's. It's been a pun in mobility studies for a quarter of a century now. And every time we say it, unless we have a Canadian accent, we have to say it and spell it out. And so what happens if you start thinking of the world in terms of roots rather than roots?
Yeah.
And that's the kind of starting point is, what if we start from things that move rather than starting from things that are fixed? How do we see the world differently? So that's what mobility studies is.
That's the roots versus roots is a great pun as well, in terms of thinking about how to encapsulate that paradigm shift as well, or the evolution from place to mobility. I'm curious because I guess when people think of the sciences, at least this is very simplistic, but they often think of the scientific method. So things like the randomized controlled trial, hypotheses, experiments. And to say geography is a science, I'm curious what kind of methods geographers employ to gain knowledge about the world.
Yeah, I think anthropology might make a claim to this, I suppose, but I think geography is the discipline that has the widest range. So I'm in a school of geosciences where some of us are geographers and some of us are earth scientists. So that's even wider. But the far end of physical geography is essentially science of the natural world, the physical world. And it can be people studying how individual grains of sand move in a riverbed. or, it's very scientific. There isn't so much of the kind of, controlled experiment with the control and, all that kind of thing that you might do in a lab. That's more field science. So it's people outside it. So it's a bit more like ecology or something like that. And it moves all the way through the social sciences to the humanities and the arts too. So there's one of the most exciting bits of geography at the moment is called creative geographies, and it's people playing around with all the different ways you can express human relationships to planet Earth. That is the definition that my supervisor gave of geography, was the study of Earth as the home of people.
Oh, wow.
And it's both the Earth and it's the people, but really it's about home.
Huh.
So it's people on one end, Earth on the other, but it's the home bit. It's how do we make this place a home?
Wow.
And I kind of like that. I mean, it has maybe a few problems about how some people are excluded from home, but that in itself is interesting too, right? It's if you think about it that way, then it becomes interesting. So the methods that we use range from, there are labs for sure, but there are also field science. There's more statistical kind. I have health geography colleagues who do loads of mass statistical exercises on health, which is not dissimilar from a lot of people working in public health. There's more social sciencey kind of ethnographic, talking to people, participant observation, being in the field and meeting people and observing. And then there's archival historical geography, which is really like a historian would work. And then there's just sort of like I am, basically just a magpie, just collect stuff and try and write convincing narratives that people either believe or don't believe about something that makes something make sense, which is much more like I don't know, what's that like? It's like I suppose it's somewhat like a journalist, which is a somewhat disparaging term in academia, but I don't mind it. I like journalists, good ones, good long form journalism I really like.
Well, me too. That's what I aspire to. I love the idea of a magpie too. I don't know if you're familiar with the fantasy author Philip Pullman.
Yes, of course.
But he has said that his spirit animal as a writer is a magpie, collecting things from different fables and stories, and yeah.
Oh, I love that. I mean, I love Philip Pullman, and I want to share the magpie, and there aren't enough animals for everyone to have their own, so I think we can share.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, one of the things you talk about in your work is mobility as not just a neutral concept, but one that carries a whole politics to it. So, what are the politics of mobility? And can you give us some everyday examples that illustrate that?
Sure. So first of all, one of the things that thinking of things starting with mobility changes is a general suspicion of mobility. So there are all kinds of pathologies of mobility, I guess you would call them. If we know from the Bible, the curse of Cain, you're cursed to wander around the world forever. It's often seen, it has been seen in Judeo-Christian societies as a curse. And I believe in other societies too, that wanderers or people that travel are often thought of as somehow cursed and in a position of loss and lack and not belonging. Our story of how civilization developed. Civilization is related to the word for culture, and the word for culture is related to agriculture. And that was all about that humans were nomadic, and then they stopped being nomadic as they became civilized. They plowed the earth, and then they had a surplus, and they got cities, and they didn't need to travel anymore. They didn't need to move around the world looking for food. For foraging, they could grow their own, and they could herd cattle and things like that. And so we have a very big story about who we are, which is about we are people that stopped having to move in some way. More recently, you can think there's all kinds of people that are deemed as suspects, and now that, of course, the predominant group that we talk about is migrants or refugees or asylum seekers, and all of the negative conversations or negative narratives about these people are part of, unfortunately, the modern condition in the West. So to back off from that slightly, one of the scholars that's influenced me is a sociologist called Zygmunt Bauman. And Zygmunt Bauman was interested in what modern society was like and wrote meta-scale analyses of what he called liquid modernity. And so you might gather from the word liquid, central to that was the idea that the predominant value of our time is movement. And this was quite a a change in the sense that when we think about hierarchies, we've traditionally thought about a social hierarchy as being something to do with our address. So if we think of a city, if I think of Edinburgh, I think of where I live, Colinton or Morningside or various other places of Edinburgh as good addresses where people who've done well live. And then there are other parts of the city that have been stigmatized where you know, any city you'll know this. This is familiar. But what Bauman was arguing is we can do the same thing by how we travel. Just the image of a flight is almost perfect. So a plane and the airport as a combination. The airport is a place where you go. You have a different lines for which ticket you've booked or which frequent flyer program you've been successful in. You have a fast track through immigration if you've done well. And you have to stand in a line and move slowly if you've done not so well. You have a lounge if you've done well. You don't if you haven't done well. And when you get in the plane, you have more room and a bigger seat and you can sleep and even more oxygen. There's more oxygen in the front of the plane than there is in the back of the plane. More toilets available per person. This is a metaphor for the politics of mobility, basically.
That's amazing.
And that is a map, a kind of map of society. A society is like that. And they're related. The slowness of the people in the slow lane is related to the people being speedy in the fast lane, because if you have limited space in an airport and limited resources for staff, you're taking some staff and putting them in the fast lane. You're taking some of the space, so you have different corridors for fast lane to go in. So everybody in the slow lane moves a bit slower. And so that's also part of the metaphor, is that in society, when you move fast, you slow people down. So maybe an even better example is high-speed rail being introduced in American cities, or highways being introduced in American cities in the 50s and 60s, often meant that the neighborhoods, which were often black neighborhoods, were cut off from each other. And these highways would connect areas of relative wealth at the same time as houses were being demolished, were predominantly lower class, poorer people, predominantly people of color in American cities, very famously like in Chicago, where they deliberately avoided the mayor's house and a very wealthy white area and dissected black areas, which not only black people couldn't use as much, but also the actual road itself was a barrier. It was, as well as being a way of moving, it was a way of immobilizing, because it stopped the connections between things, because not every road in the old neighborhood had a tunnel under it. So it slowed people down. And this happens all over society, from commuters, migrants. There are whole realms of super citizens that can travel around the world easily, regardless of their actual citizenship, and just, you know, get into these sort of tunnels of elite experience and move along these tunnels into, if you like, capsules of elite experience, in often gated environments and posh hotels. And it doesn't matter where they're from really anymore, where other people who are citizens cannot have, are frequently stopped. So you can think about the stopping of people of color, particularly black drivers in America, or who appear to be of Middle Eastern origin in Britain. All of these things are examples of that. And so I developed this in my recent book, The Citizen and the Vagabond, to talk about these ideal figures. So a citizen, again, is this figure that can move easily without hindrance, and both within a territory, because if you are a citizen of a country, then you can move around it freely in a non-authoritarian state anyway, and across boundaries, so that if you have a passport that says you're a citizen of X, then you're allowed to move across most boundaries in the world and not be hindered unless you've broken the law. If you look at the front of your passport, it says something like that to allow you to travel. Whereas another figure that's also mobile is the vagabond. So the vagabond is this figure from the medieval period. In the 14th century onwards, as feudalism started to break down, people started to become more mobile because they were released from the bonds of the lord, and they appeared in cities around the world. And suddenly there were some people who would turn up, and they had to start developing ways of figuring out how to look after them, because charity had worked based on you belonging to a place. You owed charity to people who were from where you were from, but you didn't owe it to people who were not where you were from. So they started to give people like passes that were the origins of passports, little tickets that said you're eligible for charity. And if you didn't have it, then you weren't. And then eventually people who kept asking for it but weren't supposed to have it would get branded. In Switzerland, they would be branded. And this was like a mark that said, don't give them any money. It was like a I don't know, I call it primitive biometrics, but it was
Yeah.
it was a way of sorting people. And then this became more and more over time, so that you ended up with a nation state and the passport system. And that was sort of came from that starting point of how do we tell people who belong and people who don't belong. And the people that don't belong were the vagabonds, and there were vagrancy laws all over Europe and then the Americas, all over the world. In fact, it was used by colonial administrators too to decide who was worthy and who was unworthy. And so I use that as a metaphor in the citizen and the vagabond to think about how different aspects of mobility divide us along these this continuum from a sort of free-flowing agent to someone that's either forced to move or forced or stopped from moving, but not of their own volition, which is the vagabond.
Wow. I had no idea that was the history of the passport. That's kind of mind-blowing.
Well, I mean...
So it was actually that people... It was actually a charity concept that there were certain people who were entitled to care?
It's a... I mean, it isn't the only part of the history. There's more to it than that. But it's a significant time when a document was developed for some people to be able to get arms, and also other kinds of documents that were there to stop you from getting arms. So yes, it was about the sudden increasing fluidity of society. The society was becoming more mobile from a very fixed period in European history where the vast majority of people didn't move very far.
Sure.
And so there were exceptions, like when there's a big drought or disaster, when there's a mass movement of people. But everyday life for most people was being where they are and staying where they are.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I feel like you actually anticipated two of my questions, one of which was how the figure of the citizen shapes and in some ways helps us to rethink our ideas of belonging and borders.
The citizen has a history of geographies, but in the West it was associated with the ancient cities of Greece and Rome, where you could belong, you could be a citizen of the city, and that was the space that you belonged to. And it was always defined against people that didn't belong. And so that included, then at least, enslaved people, women, children, and anyone outside. And that included the barbarians, and the barbarians were the people that, didn't belong even to Rome, and they were outside of it. And that notion of the citizen dissolves as the Roman Empire disappeared. And then in medieval times, you started to get this idea of the citizen as belonging to towns. So in the German tradition, you have the burger, and the burger belonged to the burg, which is the town. And so merchant cities began to have this sense of freedom about them because the merchant class was expanding, and of course they had to move because that was trade. So there was a phrase in medieval Europe, the city air makes men free, because you could escape the bonds of feudalism, and if you could sort of escape and be away in the city for a year and a day, I think it was, then you could become a burgher or a citizen, and you were free. You could move around that city, and to a certain degree other kinds of freedom as well. That would have been true in medieval Europe right through the 15th, 16th century, and then the emergence of what we now know as the nation state. The passport system was very recent. It was really didn't reach its pinnacle into what it is today until the 20th century, but the nation state really emerged full-fledged in the 19th century. Countries we think we know now, like Italy, didn't exist as Italy, or Germany didn't exist as Germany until very recently. They were sets of like principalities and other kinds of mini versions of nation states. So then the citizen becomes a citizen of the nation state. But there is an emerging sense of that breaking down as we reach a more fluid world. So there's the idea of a citizen of Europe. Right. People talk since Immanuel Kant about the idea of being a citizen of the world, a cosmopolite, which doesn't have any legal standing, but is an idea. And that is one of the ideas that people on the right are getting very angry about right now is there is no such thing as a global citizen. If you're a citizen of nowhere, then, if you're a citizen of the world, then you're a citizen of nowhere. And who wants to be from nowhere?
Sure.
And so the local is becoming important again. So that's the genealogy of that idea of the citizen. And now, there are these sort of super citizens who almost doesn't matter where they're from because they're so wealthy, they can just move easily across the world in various ways.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a really interesting how that that concept and that figure is almost defined by relationship to that other specter of the vagabond that you talk about, and how that's kind of evolved over time to relate to the concept of being out of place.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the citizen in ancient Rome and Greece was always defined in relation to the enslaved person and the people outside of the city. It doesn't make sense as a category without an outside. The outside makes it. And so that became much more the vagabond, as the vagabond was invented as a kind of character in, or that term, the vagrant and vagabond became terms in medieval Europe and then spread. And that would then became because often vagabonds are literally citizens of somewhere. Like if you have a homeless person in Britain in the 18th century, they were still from Britain or from, Derby or wherever they happened to be from, but they were defined as something else. They were defined as not quite a citizen. They were the poor, but not the worthy poor. They were people that these stories began to develop of, these are the people that might come to your back door and threaten your wife. Right. So there were all these sort of narratives, and it was always that in those days, these narratives of threat associated with them. And so, yes, the vagabond became this figure from, I'd say, the end of the 14th century onwards, that quickly was the part of moral panics, and there were laws all out, the vagrancy laws were introduced, which are still used today to stop protests and things like that. Traveled through empire into the Americas, and a huge body of law that makes a huge list of crimes of which hardly know why they're a crime, all in one kind of law. So basically it becomes a law of identity. You can't be a vagabond or a vagrant.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's interesting too how you can kind of trace the evolution of this figure as a figure and concept over the ages and throughout different places, because of course, as you mentioned, one of the narratives we have now is the sort of indigenous or nativist identity versus the migrant identity. And they're also defined, in opposition to each other, who belongs and who needs to leave. So, we're also doing this book club on Olga Tokarczuk's novel Flights. And at the center of, almost right in the middle of her novel, is this story that has the figure of this runaway woman who belongs to this religious sect that practices movement as a way to ward off evil. And it's actually the title of the novel in the original Polish. I'm probably not going to say this correctly, but Bieguny, which translates into something like runners. And there's this interesting moment where she and another woman who is running away from her domestic life, basically, are apprehended by the police, and one is released while the other is written up for disturbing the peace. And it almost feels like the perfect example of some of the dynamics you're discussing around the citizen and the vagabond, and how some forms of mobility are celebrated while others are condemned. I'm just thinking, like, what determines whether movement is seen as a sign of status and stability versus something that is stigmatized and suspicious?
It's a really good question. And of course, I've probably focused more on the negative stories about mobility when we've been talking, but it's always balanced by the positive ones. So you mentioned gender. So also the case that women moving. I mean, one of the case studies I wrote about in On the Move in 2006 was about early drivers, when women started to be allowed to drive. And the scandals, and what people thought that they weren't rational enough, women couldn't drive, and it was also going to drive their bodies crazy in some way, and they'll get hysterical. And suffragists, people who were trying to win the vote, started to use cars a lot. They started to drive around with no male driver, with flags and things, and you started to use it as a strategy. And this is a story has been repeated a million times over. Is that a kind of technology or infrastructure that allows movement to happen creates a certain kind of dominant structure, but at the same time makes possible its undoing. You can think of it on a smaller scale with protests now against fossil fuels. People can just block a road, and it becomes this huge symbol of protest. And so what has become interesting, so your question is, I would generally answer and say that mostly the vagabonds become people that are otherwise marginalized, so racially, through gender, also through class. Any number of disability for sure. That's a big one. Other forms of marginalization. And I wouldn't just say that this politics of mobility reflects those divisions. I would say in the contemporary world, it's instrumental in producing them.
Interesting.
Stopping people and letting people move, and then making stories about how people move, so the narratives involved with it, have become instrumental in producing contemporary hierarchies of power.
Sure.
You asked me about what geography was. I think geography is the study of things that are instrumental in the production of these hierarchies, and mobility is one of them. And now, of course, we start to get privileged people being... also, so what the reason it's a complicated answer is that certain kinds of privilege are now being scapegoated for their mobility, in that sense that global cosmopolitan elites are mobile, and they are part of the problem,
Yes.
according to this more nativist tradition in politics.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. There was another question I had a little while back, which is that the book also refers to these lectures on travel psychology. And when I first read them, I was like, what is travel psychology? It's not something I'd encountered. And so, yeah, I was curious if travel psychology is something you're either familiar with and or what you make of this concept.
So I think it's fictional, and I think I would know by now if there was a travel psychology. But that isn't to say there isn't, psychologists have engaged with travel. I mean, that's a different thing, rather than it being a subfield. There's a whole history of psychologies of various forms of movement. So we could talk, for instance, about the diagnosis of fugue. A fugue state is a state where someone finds themselves somewhere, didn't know how they got there, and doesn't really know who they are. Or sometimes they remember who they are, but don't know how they got there. So a kind of like a large version of sleepwalking. And the Canadian philosopher Ian Hacking wrote a book called Mad Travelers about this diagnosis. There was a formal diagnosis in, diagnostic manuals right up until recently. And it was kind of invented at the same time as tourism was becoming prevalent and vagrancy was a problem in France. And so there was this whole, what he calls like an ecosystem, an ecology of mobility that was new. And so there became this diagnostic of a kind of worrying travel, a kind of travel that was psychologically determined in particular ways. Another example of this sort of pathologization of travel, or making it into diagnostic, is, and this goes back to your runaway women observation from the novel, is that runaway slaves were diagnosed. I can't remember the name of it, but there was a particular diagnosis, which was that they had some psychological problem, not that they were enslaved in horrible conditions and they were trying to find freedom, which is the obvious answer,
Sure.
but they had a psychological flaw, or a diagnosis of a certain kind that explained it. And I mean, there's so many. George Beard was a doctor in 19th century America who wrote a book called Neurasthenia. And the neurasthenia was a diagnosis of a kind of overwhelmingly sort of overwhelm of 19th century life. So it seemed very familiar to us now, talking about, how can we slow down and disconnect and have our attention not be all about social media and things like that. But then he said that people were being driven kind of crazy by steam power and the telegraph, like communication and steam engines were between them. Producing this kind of people couldn't keep up anymore with life. It was too fast. The timetables existed, and they were going a bit kind of distracted and crazy from it. Early forms of train travel are full of like diagnoses that are somewhat just medical and sometimes psychological. People believed that their hearts would stop over 30 miles an hour. There was discussion of women's uteruses flying out of their body if they went too fast. It was just, horrible images. And so there's a whole history of psychologists, and I'm sure that's true today as well. I'm sure psychologists now, that there are diagnoses that are related to travel and attention and a speeded up world. And it's certainly true in popular culture. We think about all the ways in which our world of on-time production, being able to go anywhere we want very quickly and quite cheaply, having our attention on our phones all the time, that whole world of a hypermobile world is starting to be heavily diagnosed, and how we deal with it and live with it is something that, although I'm familiar with similar things from the 19th century, is clearly different in some ways in the 21st century. So I don't think there is a sub-discipline called travel psychology. I don't think there's anyone advertising for jobs for travel psychologists, but it's remarkably close to mobility studies. It feels like I felt seen when I read about it in her book.
Excellent. It's always good to feel seen. So, I mean, you kind of mentioned this, but your scholarship is actually quite interdisciplinary. And I mean, you're also a poet. So, what inspires your poetry, and how do you relate it to your work as a geographer?
Yeah. So I think I've written poetry since I was a kid, sometimes more and sometimes less. And I had inspirational English teachers at school, like I said at the beginning of this conversation. But I think it was my version of a midlife crisis in 2008. Instead of buying a sports car, I signed up for a poetry workshop, basically, that was run by Faber and Faber, the publisher, called Becoming a Poet.
Much more affordable.
Much more affordable, but it was expensive still. I could have got a very cheap, very old sports car maybe. So there were 12 people, and I didn't think I'd get in. There were 12 people in this room, and we were visited by the kind of Illuminati of British poetry. And it was an amazing experience. It was like to take something seriously and learning. I loved being a student when I'd been a teacher for so long. And so the craft of it became something took me away from my job. And I just thought, this is something else I will do. But needless to say, after a while, it became clear that the things I was writing about were not that dissimilar from the things I write about in my academic life. Forms of belonging and not belonging, forms of moving. I have so many poems about airports. It's not true.
Oh, wow.
Like animals and plants and other things that are not quite where they're supposed to be. So like I have a poem called Erratic, which is about rocks that are in places they didn't originate from. And the word for that is an erratic. So you find like a limestone rock, a boulder in an area that is mostly associated with sandstone or granite, and like, how did it get there? And often they were moved by water, or long time ago by ice or some other way. And so this was interesting to me poetically, so I wrote. And also the word erratic is related to the word error, and it's also related to the word wanderer. And it's interesting that wanderer and error have the same root. So again, you come back to this idea of
fascinating.
Mobility as an error in the system. And so I wrote a poem about an erratic, a rock that thinks through some of these things. So I like different writing challenges as well as different disciplinary challenges. And so they all work together in interesting ways.
That's great. So Tokarczuk talks about her novel as a constellation. And I wonder if that's something that you think about in your poetry and your work when you're assembling and thinking through form and movement.
Absolutely, yeah. One of the interesting things to me is that the Greek word topos, which is a word for place or places, topoi, I guess, is places, is also the word for a kind of rhetorical form. So in Aristotle, he wrote about the importance of having the right form, rhetorical form, for whatever it is you're arguing about. So obviously there are tragic forms and comic forms and all that kind of thing. So one of the things that's interested me is how in the book Flights, but also in Walter Benjamin and other writers, a form matches how we think about place and how we think about movement. I always link it back to Walter Benjamin, who was a German philosopher who was died on the border of trying to escape to Spain and basically killed himself because he wasn't going to escape the Nazis. He was Jewish. And his Arcades project was a big project he's writing about Paris, and it exists as a series of files they are in what they called convolutes, which are like files, and they're themed like photography or wandering, but they're still very fragmentary. They're little quotes he's collected like you would in a commonplace book or in his own observations, and it's great. Walter Benjamin also used the word constellation a lot. That was his term to think about a kind of structure that's not a structure, that it's a pattern that emerges from the past into the present and has this kind of shocking value or exploding value. So I think in Flights, that idea of a constellation as a kind of montage or fragment form is a perfect way of thinking about travel, because travel is often about unexpected juxtapositions. travel has a kind of list-like quality. It's one thing after another in space, and that produces sparks new ideas. And so writing in the way she does about travel in this fragment form, this constellation, as she calls it, which I can't believe isn't derived from Benjamin. It must be, is perfect. And I do that too. So I think about poems as a kind of place on the page. A way a poem looks is a combination of both the words and the white space. Like in prose, the white space isn't important. In poetry, it's really important. It's the gaps and the margins, and whether you have a left aligned margin or not, left justified margin or not, and you're playing with space all the time. And so I think about poetry writing as place making. Also poesis. Poesis, the word, is making, world making, basically. Yeah. And so topopoetics is making places.
That's beautiful.
And so I've been, in my latter life at least, I've been thinking about how to write in a way that makes more sense that way, and in poetry in particular. And I really like the way it exists in flights. It's been inspirational.
Yeah. One other thing we're doing for our guests is, so Tokarczuk has these 3 travel questions she mentions, which in some ways you can actually interpret quite metaphorically, but are also literal travel questions. So, where are you from? Where are you coming in from? And where are you going?
They're great questions for a traveler. And they, in the context of sitting at my desk at home, they're slightly more metaphorical. But
yes.
Where am I from is a difficult one. For the reasons we talked about at the beginning. It is a question that my kids get visibly uncomfortable with when they're asked it, because it involves many parts of an answer. So I'm definitely English. I was born in Cambridge. And when I was born, in my paternal family history, the Cresswell, my dad's immediate, 400 years of male Cresswells had been born within about 65 miles of Cambridge. But I've never lived in Cambridge, and I've lived all over the world. So I can't, there's no easy answer to the question. To my kids, it's even worse to some degree. I mean, some of them were born in Wales. One was born in America, and 2 were born in Wales. But they're British or dual citizens. They live in different parts of the world now. It's a really complicated question. Where are you from? For me, and certainly I know that it has a certain. It has a different emphasis when it's asked to people who appear to be from elsewhere. Right. So when someone asks you where you're from,
yes,
they probably mean something different when they ask me where I'm from.
I get asked all the time in Norwich,
yes.
In fact. And then it usually goes, where are you really from?
Yeah, exactly. That's the second part. Yeah. So there's that. So where am I coming in from? Well, I came into this to be at home after my afternoon walk. So I have a walk after lunch every day because I'm in a kind of off time from teaching. So I try and get my steps in. So I came in from up the Water of Leith, walked down the river and came into this room. And where are you going? Well, my hope is that this is where I will live until it's impossible for me to live here. When I get too old to live here. So I've lived this life moving around all the time, and part of me wants to discover what belonging to somewhere lives. And I'll never really properly be able to do it because I probably haven't got long enough left, But I know people from my first job onwards who live in the places that they still live in the places where I knew them. And if you go visit them, particularly in Wales, where I had my first full-time permanent academic job, there's still people there, and they are like part of the landscape. They know everyone and everything, and everyone knows them. But I'm now trying to embrace where I am and writing about it. So that is my project. My project at the moment is to write about how people become local, how they thoughtfully invest in where they are in ways that are not exclusive, xenophobic, and exclusionary, if possible.
And I'm aware, we've covered a ton of ground in our conversation, and I wonder if listeners went away with just 1 or 2 insights or questions, what would you most hope that they take away from our time together?
I would like people to think about the ways they move and how the ways they move are different from the ways other people move, and if the ways they move impact how other people move, and how they might move differently. Like, how would you move differently in the world if the world was more just? So, I mean, I've always liked the Rawls's ideal model. You know, this idea of justice is, if at random you were born into a society, what society would you want to be born into? So there's no guarantee you're going to be the best off or the worst off. And so if you apply that to a mobile society, what kind of society would you want to be born into in terms of the way it moves? So many of the ways we move now impact other people. If we take a flight, carbon emissions, when we could take the train, it impacts other people. You know, and often the people that impacted most are people who can least afford to be impacted. So I think that's important. And I suppose the reverse of that is, how can you properly live locally? What does that mean? To live where you are, to be here.
Yeah.
You know, here is a word that literally changes depending on where you, like, it travels with me. If I say here, it moves with me. It literally means something different every time I move. It's somewhere else when I say here, if I'm somewhere else. Very few words in the English language do that. But if you invest in here, then what does it mean to be here as opposed to moving? And how can you best do that? So they're big philosophical, geographical questions. Maybe a bit much for people, you know, over their breakfast or whatever. But
No, those are great, thought-provoking questions. I'll be thinking about them for a long time. Thank you so much, Tim.
Wow, Stephanie, you weren't kidding when you said you covered a lot of ground. I don't think I'll look at the lines and lounges in an airport the same ever again. And the idea that a road can both help people move but also immobilize them, or how throughout history people have been defined by where and how they can or cannot move, citizens, slaves, vagabonds, merchants, this all complicates our ideas and assumptions about movement, and it was a fascinating conversation to listen to, and it all feels very Tokarczuk-esque.
Yeah, and he's a poet too. We're actually going to share the poem he talked about, Erratic, in our show notes, so do check that out. It's very cool.
Terrific. Well, that's all for today.
Evan, what's our discussion question this week?
So, we want to know, what's a time you were traveling, commuting, or on your way somewhere when something unexpected happened and it completely changed your course? So what was the thing that unexpectedly happened, and where did it end up taking you? Let us know. We look forward to hearing from you. This episode was produced, edited, and mixed by Stephanie Tam. Our theme music was composed by Nina Humphreys. Thank you to the Kahneman-Treisman Center for Behavioral Science and Public Policy at Princeton University for sponsoring Behavioral Scientist Reads and helping to make the podcast possible. You can subscribe to Behavioral Scientist Reads on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. You can also find us at behavioralscientist.org and our dedicated book club website, bookclub.behavioralscientist.org, to discover all our episodes, extra material, and leave feedback. Don't forget to rate and review the show. It will help other people discover the podcast. See you next time.